a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was the wife of King George VI and the mother of Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon. She was Queen Consort of the United Kingdom and the Dominions from her husband's accession in 1936 until his death in 1952, after which she was known as Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, to avoid confusion with her daughter. She was the last Empress of India. Born into a family of British nobility, she came to prominence in 1923 when she married the Duke of York, the second son of King George V, and Queen Mary. The couple and their daughters embodied traditional ideas of family and public service. She undertook a variety of public engagements and became known for her consistently cheerful countenance. In 1936, her husband unexpectedly became king when his brother, Edward VIII, abdicated in order to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. Elizabeth then became queen. She accompanied her husband on diplomatic tours to France and North America before the start of the Second World War. During the war, her seemingly indomitable spirit provided moral support to the British public. In recognition of her role as an asset to British interests, Adolf Hitler described her as the most dangerous woman in Europe. After the war, her husband's health deteriorated, and she was widowed at the age of 51. Her elder daughter, aged 25, became the new queen. From the death of Queen Mary in 1953, Elizabeth was viewed as the matriarch of the British royal family. In her later years, she was a consistently popular member of the family, even when other members were suffering from low levels of public approval. She continued an active public life until just a few months before her death at the age of 101, 7 weeks after the death of her younger daughter, Princess Margaret. Early life. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was the youngest daughter and the ninth of 10 children of Claude Bowes-Lyon, Lord Glamis, and his wife, Cecilia Cavendish Bentinck. Her mother was descended from British Prime Minister William Cavendish Bentinck, 3rd Duke of Portland, and Governor-General of India Richard Wellesley, 1st Marquis Wellesley, who was the elder brother of another Prime Minister, Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington. The location of her birth remains uncertain, but reputedly she was born either in her parents' Westminster home, at Belgrave Mansions, Grosvenor Gardens, or in a horse-drawn ambulance on the way to a hospital. Other possible locations include Forbes House in Ham, London, the home of her maternal grandmother, Louisa Scott. Her birth was registered at Hitchin, Hertfordshire, near the Strathmore's English country house, St Paul's Waldenbury, which was also given as her birthplace in the census the following year. She was christened there on the 23rd of September 1900, in the local parish church, All Saints, and her godparents included her paternal aunt Lady Maud Bowes-Lyon and cousin Venetia James. She spent much of her childhood at St Paul's Walden and at Glamis Castle, the Earl's ancestral home in Scotland. She was educated at home by a governess until the age of 8, and was fond of field sports, ponies and dogs. When she started school in London, she astonished her teachers by precociously beginning an essay with 2 Greek words from Xenophon's Anabasis. Her best subjects were literature and scripture. After returning to private education under a German Jewish governess, Ketty Kubler, she passed the Oxford local examination with distinction at age 13. On her 14th birthday, Britain declared war on Germany. 4 of her brothers served in the army. Her elder brother, Fergus, an officer in the Black Watch Regiment, was killed in action at the Battle of Loos in 1915. Another brother, Michael, was reported missing in action on the 28th of April 1917. 3 weeks later, the family discovered he had been captured after being wounded. He remained in a prisoner of war camp for the rest of the war. Glamis was turned into a convalescent home for wounded soldiers, which Elizabeth helped to run. She was particularly instrumental in organizing the rescue of the castle's contents during a serious fire on the 16th of September 1916. One of the soldiers she treated wrote in her autograph book that she was to be hung, drawn, and quartered. Hung in diamonds, drawn in a coach and 4, and quartered in the best house in the land. Marriage to Prince Albert. Prince Albert, Duke of York, Bertie, to the family, was the second son of King George V. He initially proposed to Elizabeth in 1921, but she turned him down, being afraid never again to be free to think, speak and act as I feel I really ought to. When he declared he would marry no other, his mother, Queen Mary, visited Glamis to see for herself the girl who had stolen her son's heart. She became convinced that Elizabeth was the one girl who could make Bertie happy, but nevertheless refused to interfere. At the same time, Elizabeth was courted by James Stuart, Albert's equerry, until he left the prince's service for a better paid job in the American oil business. In February 1922, Elizabeth was a bridesmaid at the wedding of Albert's sister, Princess Mary, to Viscount Lascelles. The following month, Albert proposed again, but she refused him once more. Eventually, in January 1923, Elizabeth agreed to marry Albert, despite her misgivings about royal life. Albert's freedom in choosing Elizabeth, not a member of a royal family, though the daughter of a peer, was considered a gesture in favor of political modernization. Previously, princes were expected to marry princesses from other royal families. They selected a platinum engagement ring featuring a cashmere sapphire with 2 diamonds adorning its sides. They married on the 26th of April 1923 at Westminster Abbey. Unexpectedly, Elizabeth laid her bouquet at the tomb of the unknown warrior on her way into the abbey. In memory of her brother Fergus, Elizabeth became styled Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. Following a wedding breakfast at Buckingham Palace prepared by chef Gabriel Tchumi, the new Duchess and her husband honeymooned at Polesden Lacey, a manor house in Surrey, and then went to Scotland, where she caught unromantic whooping cough. Duchess of York 1923-1936. After a successful visit to Northern Ireland in July 1924, the Labour government agreed that Albert and Elizabeth could tour East Africa from December 1924 to April 1925. The Labour government was defeated by the Conservatives in a general election in November, and the Governor-General of Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, Sir Lee Stack, was assassinated 3 weeks later. Despite this, the tour went ahead, and they visited Aden, Kenya, Uganda, and Sudan, but Egypt was avoided because of political tensions. Albert had a stammer, which affected his ability to deliver speeches, and after October 1925, Elizabeth assisted in helping him through the therapy devised by Lionel Logue, an episode portrayed in the 2010 film The King's Speech. In 1926, the couple had their first child, Princess Elizabeth, Lilibet, to the family, who would later become Queen Elizabeth II. Another daughter, Princess Margaret Rose, was born 4 years later. Albert and Elizabeth, without their child, travelled to Australia to open Parliament House in Canberra in 1927. She was, in her own words, very miserable at leaving the baby. Their journey by sea took them via Jamaica, the Panama Canal and the Pacific. Elizabeth fretted constantly over her baby back in Britain, but their journey was a public relations success. She charmed the public in Fiji when, shaking hands with a long line of official guests, a stray dog walked in on the ceremony and she shook its paw as well. In New Zealand she fell ill with a cold and missed some engagements, but enjoyed the local fishing in the Bay of Islands accompanied by Australian sports fisherman Harry Andreas. On the return journey, via Mauritius, the Suez Canal, Malta, and Gibraltar, their transport caught fire and they prepared to abandon ship before the fire was brought under control. Accession and abdication of Edward VIII. On the 20th of January 1936, King George V died and Albert's brother, Edward, Prince of Wales, became King Edward VIII. George had expressed private reservations about his successor, saying, "I pray God that my eldest son will never marry, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." Just months into his reign, Edward forced a constitutional crisis by insisting on marrying the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. Although legally Edward could have married Simpson, as king he was also head of the Church of England, which at that time did not allow divorced people to remarry. Edward's ministers believed that the people would never accept Simpson as queen and advised against the marriage. As a constitutional monarch, Edward was obliged to follow ministerial advice. Rather than abandon his plans to marry Simpson, he chose to abdicate in favor of Albert, who reluctantly became king in his place on the 11th of December 1936 under the regnal name of George VI. George VI and Elizabeth were crowned King and Queen of Great Britain, Ireland and the British Dominions, and Emperor and Empress of India in Westminster Abbey on 12 May 1937, the date previously scheduled for Edward VIII. Elizabeth's crown was made of platinum and was set with a Koh-i-Noor diamond. Edward and Simpson married and became the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, but while Edward was a Royal Highness, George VI withheld the style from the Duchess, a decision that Elizabeth supported. Elizabeth was later quoted as referring to the Duchess as "that woman," and the Duchess referred to Elizabeth as "cookie," because of her supposed resemblance to a fat Scots cook. Claims that Elizabeth remained embittered towards the Duchess were denied by her close friends. The Duke of Grafton wrote that she never said anything nasty about the Duchess of Windsor, except to say she really hadn't got a clue what she was dealing with. State visits and royal tour. In summer 1938, a state visit to France by the King and Queen was postponed for 3 weeks, because of the death of the Queen's mother, Lady Strathmore. In 2 weeks, Norman Hartnell created an all-white trousseau for the Queen, who could not wear colours as she was still in mourning. The visit was designed to bolster Anglo-French solidarity in the face of aggression from Nazi Germany. The French press praised the demeanour and charm of the royal couple during the delayed, but successful visit, augmented by Hartnell's wardrobe. Nevertheless, Nazi aggression continued, and the government prepared for war. After the Munich Agreement of 1938 appeared to forestall the advent of armed conflict, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was invited onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace, with the King and Queen to receive acclamation from a crowd of well-wishers. While broadly popular among the general public, Chamberlain's policy towards Hitler was the subject of some opposition in the House of Commons, which led historian John Grigg to describe the King's behaviour in associating himself so prominently with a politician as the most unconstitutional act by a British sovereign in the present century. However, historians argue that the King only ever followed ministerial advice and acted as he was constitutionally bound to do. In May and June 1939, Elizabeth and her husband toured Canada from coast to coast and back, and visited the United States, spending time with President Roosevelt at the White House and his Hudson Valley estate. U.S. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt said that Elizabeth was perfect as a queen, gracious, informed, saying the right thing and kind, but a little self-consciously regal. The tour was designed to bolster transatlantic support in the event of war, and to affirm Canada's status as an independent kingdom sharing with Britain the same person as monarch. According to an often-told story, during one of the earliest of the royal couple's repeated encounters with the crowds, a Boer War veteran asked Elizabeth, "Are you Scots, or are you English?" She replied, "I am a Canadian." Their reception by the Canadian and US public was extremely enthusiastic, and largely dissipated any residual feeling that George and Elizabeth were a lesser substitute for Edward. Elizabeth told Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, "That tour made us," and she returned to Canada frequently both on official tours and privately. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?